Okay, we are going to be looking at tree diagrams today. It's part of our probability unit. So if I have a coin and a dice, okay, the outcomes, there's two possible outcomes for a coin. Those outcomes would be heads and tails. Now, when I look at my dice, there are a total of 6 possible outcomes for a dice. Okay, we're talking a standard 6-sided dice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. So to make my tree diagram, it's going to be going horizontally, stretching out from heads. If I toss a coin and a dice at the same time, I could get a dice, heads on the coin and 1 on the dice, heads in 2, heads in 3, heads in 4, heads in 5, or heads in 6. Let's try not to get a printing error in here. So our outcomes would be heads 1, heads 2, heads 3, heads 4, heads 5, heads 6. Now let's move down to tails. I have exactly the same outcomes. There is no effect on my dice when I flip my coin. They're completely independent of each other. So I could have tails in 1, tails in 2, tails in 3, tails in 4, tails in 5, tails in 6. So that would be T1, tails 2, tails 3, tails 4, tails 5, and tails 6. Now you can see really quickly that this would get very long. So I know that there are 2 outcomes for the heads. Or the coin, excuse me, 2 outcomes for the coin, 6 outcomes for the dice, and if I count, there's 6 here and 6 here. So there are 2 groups of 6 to make 12. So it would be 2 times 6 equals 12. Now, if we start to look at some of our probabilities, I want to know the probability of heads and 3. That happens 1 time here, so that occurs 1 time out of all 12 possibilities, which works out to be, grabbing a calculator, 1/12. Okay, so 1 divided by 12, it is 83 hundredths, 0.83 repeating, or that happens about 8 3/10% of the time. Now, what if I wanted to know the probability of getting anything and a 6? Well, I see that I get a 6 here with heads and a 6 here with tails. So that happens 2 out of 12 times, or 1/6, which is, and again, grabbing my calculator, actually that one I don't need to, it is 16 hundredths repeating, or 16 7/10%. Okay, now the probability of heads with an odd number. Okay, so I see that this happens with a 1, a 3, and a 5. None of these, so that happens 3 out of 12 times, which is 25 hundredths. It's reduced to 1/4. So that happens 25% of the time. Okay, so that's a basic on how to do this with 2. We're now going to look at 1 with 3, and then possibly a little bit of an experiment. This would be part of today's lesson. So I want to know what happens if I've got 3 coins. Well, I've got coin 1. Coin 1 can be either heads or tails. Let's get it so that it's actually on the screen. Okay, now I'm going to go to coin 2. It has exactly the same choices. It could be heads or tails. If my first coin was heads, my second coin is heads and tails. But if my first coin was a tail, my second coin is still heads and tails. Now let's grab coin 3. Now, doesn't matter what happened back here. If this is where I'm starting, it's still heads or tails. If this is where I'm starting, its heads or tails. So tree diagram because every branch comes off of the previous branch, okay? Don't cross branches. They can't have multiple branches coming off of multiple places. Okay, heads had 2 branches. This one had the same branches. Okay, this one, coming off of this result, we have the branches of heads and tails. Off of this result, we have the branches of heads and tails. Sorry, I got a cat in the way. Now let's look back up here real quickly. So off of this branch, we've got the 6 branches. Off of this one, we've got 6 branches. Okay, so coming back down here, let's do our outcomes. Okay, so I see, okay, more cat, sorry. If I follow along here, I've got 3 heads. If I follow here, and I think I will go ahead and just underline this quickly. Here, here, and here, I'm going to underline in a minute. I've got 2 heads and a tail. Okay, this one, heads, tails, heads, heads. And this one, heads, tails, tails. Coming down here, tails, followed by 2 heads. Heads, or I'm sorry, tail, head, tail. Tail, tail, head. And 3 tails in a row. Okay, so I am going to do some quick underlining right here, some highlighting perhaps. Okay, so I want to know how often I can get the probability of 3 heads. I should write this correctly. The probability of 3 heads, it happens 1 out of my 8 outcomes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, let's come back up here. If I have got 2 groups for the first, 2 outcomes for the first, times 2 outcomes for the second, times 2 outcomes for the third, heads or tails, 2 outcomes, heads or tails, 2 outcomes, heads or tails, 2 outcomes. 2 times 2 times 2 is 8 total. Okay, now I want to know the probability of 2 heads. And I'm going to highlight those. I've got 2 heads here. I've got 2 heads here. They're just written in a different order. And I've got 2 heads right there. Again, written in a different order. That happened 3 out of 8 times. Now, let's look for what happens for the probability of 2, excuse me, let's write that correctly, the probability of 1 head. Okay, 1 head happens here, there's 2 tails, 1 head in the center here, and 1 head here. That happened 3 ways also. So that is also 3/8. And we're going to get to writing our percents in a minute. So the probability of 0 heads, right down here, it happens 1/8 of the time. Okay, so 1/8 happens 12.5% of the time. 3/8 happens 37.5% of the time. And again, back down here to 12.5%. Now, if you add these up, you'll see that these actually total 100%. Now, if I was going to conduct this experiment, I would make a quick chart, 3 heads, 2 heads, 1 head, 0 heads. I would grab my coins and I would begin tossing my coins. And you can see I've got 3 pennies here, and I got 3 heads first time out. I'm going to make a tally. Okay, I'm going to do this a second time. Don't need to flip them. I'm just going to toss all 3 at once. And I see I got 3 tails. That's shocking. So 0 heads. Not really the results I expected, to be honest. You just proved I didn't have all 3-headed coins. Okay, 1 head. Okay, let's do one more flip and then move on to something a little bit different. Okay, I have got 3 tails. Okay, as I'm doing tallies, fastest way to do a tally, 1, 2, 3, 4, cross. Okay, this way it's in groups of 5 and it's easy to calculate. Thank you. Have a great day.